What's up, guys, and happy Thanksgiving. So as you guys probably know, Disney Plus has released the first 2 episodes of Hawkeye, and I thought I would take this opportunity to point out some of the differences that these characters have to their comic book counterparts. But before we get started, in case you guys haven't seen the first 2 episodes of Hawkeye, I'm letting you know now, spoilers. So the episode starts out with the big numbers of 2012 plastered on the screen, which some of us already know is when the Avengers fought the Battle of New York. We're introduced to a younger Kate Bishop, and we're introduced to her parents, Derek and Eleanor Bishop. During the battle, the house where Kate lives in ends up getting a giant hole in the wall, which is when Kate ends up seeing Hawkeye. It's cool to see that the first person she sees isn't Iron Man or Captain America, it's a regular guy with a bow and arrow. They tried to go and find Kate's dad, but come to find out, he died. In the comics, it happened very differently. It wasn't her dad who died, it was her mom who died on a trip to Boulder, Colorado. The first time Kate meets Hawkeye is when she finds out that her dad is involved with some pretty bad people. Kate at the time looked up to her dad a lot, so she decided to investigate further to see what was going on. She follows her dad to see that he meets up with someone named El Matador to end up accidentally getting caught by both of them. But right when one of the Matador's men was about to capture her, an arrow comes in and saves her. And then the Avengers show up because it turns out that Hawkeye had been keeping an eye on El Matador. So Kate became very impressed by the Avengers, but especially Hawkeye. She figured that if a human being could fight that way, what would prevent her from doing the same? And since she just saw her dad in a new light, she found herself a new role model. Now saying that out loud, I'm realizing that the show has taken away her dad so that she can end up seeing Hawkeye as a role model since she's without a male figure. We then get to meet Kate a lot older, wearing purple, which is almost close to her comic book costume. It looks like she's been dared to ring a bell at her school by her friend named Greer. Now, that name Greer might be related to the comics, might not be, but the name Greer comes from a character named Tigra, who's actually someone that Hawkeye fights in the comics. Now, in case you guys did not know, the bell that Kate rings is named after Obadiah Stane. If you guys don't remember Obadiah Stane, well... yeah, not a great guy. But S.H.I.E.L.D. covered up all the stuff that he did, so his legacy is intact. We then go to Hawkeye watching Rogers the Musical, which is basically the musical of the Avengers. So we see the actors doing a portrayal of the Battle of New York, and for some reason Ant-Man is there, but Hawkeye points out he was not. So we get our first look at one of the things that's comically accurate about Hawkeye going deaf. Now in episode 2, they point out that Hawkeye goes deaf because of all the explosions and all the stuff that he's had to endure as an Avenger. But in the comic books, Clint has actually been having to deal with his hearing loss since the 1980s. Like in 1983, he had to use a sonic arrow to keep himself from being brainwashed, and he ended up losing about 80% of his hearing. But in the comic book that this show is based on, Clint actually lost his hearing due to child abuse. He did learn sign language, but he was too embarrassed to use it because it reminded him of his trauma. Now this may seem weird, and it might be, but it shows Hawkeye at a urinal, and the urinal says Thanos was right. Because you know how some people will write things on the walls. But this one says Thanos was right, and goes back to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, how the Flag Smashers were so hell-bent on trying to get everything back to the way it was before everybody was snapped back. It also goes back to the situation with Magneto, where some people believe that it was right for him to start a war so that the mutants could be considered equal. After losing her husband several years ago, Eleanor ends up finding somebody new named Jack Duquesne. Jack is a swords collector and an expert swordsman. We also get introduced to Armand Duquesne III, who is actually Jack's uncle in the show. The reason I say in the show is because in the comics, Armand is actually Jack's father, and Armand is actually a government official that works in Sincong. Kate sees something fishy going on with Eleanor and Armand. It looks like they're having an argument. She ends up finding Jack downstairs to see that they're at an underground black market auction. At the auction, they're selling a giant Triceratops head. They're selling the sword that Ronin used, which is, of course, Hawkeye, and the Ronin suit. But the auction gets interrupted by a group known as the Tracksuit Mafia. I will explain them in a minute. So Kate decides to put on the suit herself and fight off some of the Mafia members. She ends up going out into the street and saving a dog with one eye. In the comics, this is actually Lucky the Pizza Dog. He was Hawkeye's sidekick and has actually saved him before. Oh, and there's also possibly a reference to Avengers number 268. There's a goon who tries to grab a watch, and the watch says Avengers Compound number 268. This has nothing to do with Hawkeye, but this is also a comic book that actually heavily lies on Kang the Conqueror. The comic book is called The Kang Dynasty, and it lies heavily on Kang the Conqueror, who's being introduced into the MCU if you guys saw Loki. But going back, so Kate goes to see what Armand is up to, and she ends up finding him dead with a sword wound through his chest. While Kate is running away from the scene of the crime, she ends up getting chased by the Tracksuit Mafia because they think she's Ronin. Now Kate's able to hold her own with the Mafia, but she ends up getting saved by Clint. Now going to episode 2, let's talk about the Tracksuit Mafia real quick. In the comics, they were known as the Tracksuit Draculas, which is a name given by Hawkeye. Now here it's basically showing them as comic relief, but they're actually a group of people that Hawkeye dealt with subparly. So the Tracksuit Mafia attacks Kate's apartment and burns it down. They try to get the Ronin suit, but they're surrounded by fire, so they weren't able to grab it. So Kate is able to take Clint to an apartment owned by her aunt Moira Brandon. Now, I did not know this, but come to find out that name Moira Brandon is actually a nod to Moira Brandon in the comics, who's actually a retired actress who appeared in Avengers West Coast number 100. She had sold her mansion to the Avengers, so it would become their new compound. And on top of that, she actually risked her life to save Hawkeye and became an honorary member of the Avengers before she passed. Clint goes back to Kate's apartment to get the Ronin suit back, but it's disappeared. He does find a clue on a fire truck that says NYC LARPers. We then see that the situation gets so serious that Clint ends up having to send his kids home. Now, while Clint is taking Kate to a safe place, which is her mom's security company, we see what I mentioned before, a glimpse of how Clint actually lost his hearing. I try to think that Tony should have suffered the same problem, but 1, Tony has died. 2, Black Widow has also died. And that leaves Clint to be the only human who doesn't have a super ability to protect any kind of hearing damage he would have suffered. So Clint goes to confront the New York City LARPers, who are actually a group of live-action role players. So we get this really funny scene of Clint just fighting off these bunch of people role-playing, and he's Hawkeye, so obviously he can fight right through if he wanted to. So then he finally comes up to the person who's wearing the Ronin costume, and his person's name is Grills. Now Grills in the comics is actually a friend and a neighbor of Hawkeye. But in the comics he does meet an untimely death, which I'm hoping they don't do this with the show because he seems very funny. So while at her mom's office, Kate gets a call from a Detective Codley. Detective Codley in the comics is actually someone who's allied himself with Kate and gives her any information she needs. I don't know how important he's going to be now, but I'm hoping that he sticks to being an ally. So Kate is very suspicious of Jack, thinking that he may be responsible for the death of Armand, since Armand was killed by a sword. Kate decides to challenge him to a sword fight to see if she could try to get the truth out of him. But like I said before, Jack is a pretty good swordsman. Now going back to Jack in the comics, he's not a great guy. Now in the comics he's a very good swordsman, but he has a gambling problem, as we kind of see in the show that he's a little bit broke. But after the sword fight, Jack ends up offering Kate a candy. What freaks out Kate is that the candy that he offers her was the candy that was at Armand's house. So Kate, now very spooked, decides to go and find Hawkeye. Now earlier, after Clint had gotten the Ronin suit, he had tried to clear things up with the Tracksuit Mafia so they could stop chasing Kate. But the Mafia ends up taking Clint anyway. So while Kate is trying to call Clint, one of the Mafia members answers the phone and she finds out that he's been kidnapped. So Kate uses the security system that her mom's company has to try to track Clint's phone. Now the username that Kate has is Bishop112012, which is an homage to the first appearance of Kate and Lucky the Pizza Dog in Hawkeye Volume 4, number 2. Now while Kate is trying to rescue Hawkeye, she bursts through the floor and they both end up getting captured. So Ivan, one of the main members of the Mafia, goes to tell their boss that they've captured Clint and Kate. And this is where we get introduced to Maya Lopez, aka Echo. Now in case you didn't know, Echo was actually the first person to wear the Ronin suit. And also, she is the adopted daughter of Wilson Fisk. And if you don't remember Wilson Fisk, he was actually on the Daredevil TV series. Now Wilson Fisk is actually heavily involved in the comic book that this show is adapting. And I really hope they bring back Vincent D'Onofrio because he played Wilson Fisk really good in the Daredevil series. As far as my review of the show, I like it. I like that they're bringing Hawkeye to deal with the consequences of him wearing the Ronin suit when everybody was gone during Endgame. And I like Kate Bishop. Haley Steinfeld plays her very well. In the comics, she's a very stubborn person. And Haley plays it very well. I don't know how the Echo character is going to go because I don't really know much about her, but I'm about to spend a lot of time finding out who she is. I don't know how different this is going to be from the comic book that Matt Fraction and David Ajah made, but I'm hoping they try to stay as close to it as they can because I do hear it's very good. And I'm saying I do hear because I need to take the time to read it. I will say I really do want Wilson Fisk to come back, especially the guy who played him. But we'll see how this goes. But those are all the Easter eggs and differences I was able to find. If there's stuff that you guys found that I forgot to mention, please, the comments are down below. Don't be afraid to let me know. But that's it for me, guys. Thank you again for watching. Have a happy Thanksgiving. And this has been Filmsplaining. See ya.